And essentially, there are two main themes that we focus on. One is, if you will, the injustice side of it. And we argue that just as in the 19th century, the central moral challenge for the world was slavery. In the 20th century, the paramount moral challenge was totalitarianism. In this century, the paramount moral challenge, the cause of our times, is gender inequity around the world. Now, when we say that, I think people often think that it's meant in a hyperbolic way, and it's really not. It really is exactly the way we see it. And one reason has to do with the scale and toll of gender inequity. Are there more boys or girls in the world today, more men or women, more males or females in the world today? Let's have a vote. If you think there are more males in the world today, can you raise your hand? If you think there are more females in the world today, can you raise your hand? I'm afraid this latter group is wrong. First group was right. There are actually more males in the world today. Certainly more females in the United States, in Europe, in this room. But globally, there are more males, and that is because in much of the world, discrimination is lethal, starting with sex-selective abortion, starting with unfair distribution of food and health care. This is a picture I took in Ethiopia. You look at it, and you see hunger, you see famine, starvation. But what you need to know is that every kid in this emergency feeding center was a girl. This girl's brothers were doing just fine. In so much of the world, if you don't have enough food to go around, you starve your daughter to feed your son. And the result of that is something like 2 million girls dying through excess mortality each year. The cost of that on a broader level is that over the last 50 years, more women and girls have been discriminated against to death than all the men who died in all the battles of the 20th century. Another way of looking at it is in any one decade, more girls are discriminated against to death than people died in all the genocides of the 20th century. The toll is just staggering. And when it is on that scale, then I think that truly is the paramount moral challenge for this century. But there's another theme that we emphasize, and it's maybe a happier one, and I think it's one that has to be front and center in this movement. And that is that putting aside the injustices, if you just want to focus on how you can bring about change, overcome poverty, then the most cost-effective way of doing that is to invest in girls, bring those educated women out of the margins into the center of society. To put it another way, as we heard, women and girls aren't the problem, they're the solution. And there are a number of reasons for that. If you want to deal with overpopulation issues, you have to focus on women and girls. Something that is, I think in some ways, the dirty little secret of development, and that is that a lot of the suffering in impoverished countries is not due only to low incomes, although that's obviously a factor, but also to bad spending decisions. And those are disproportionately by men. And over the last 15 years, there's been abundant evidence of this across continents, across religions, across regions, that, for example, among people earning less than $1 per person per day, which, as you know, is a standard global metric of poverty, it looks as if about 2% of incomes is invested in education. In contrast, about 20% goes to a combination of alcohol, tobacco, prostitution, sugary drinks, and very extravagant festivals. If you could take 4 percentage points out of the alcohol, tobacco, prostitution pool and put it into the education pool, that would have a transformative effect on so many countries. And one way of doing that is precisely to give women more control over legal assets, to give girls more education, more chance to earn incomes. Another reason to focus on girls is just that if you look at what unexploited economic resources poor countries have, it's not diamonds, it's not gold, it's not oil. It's the female halves of their population. Bill Gates, I think, put it very well. He was speaking to a group in Saudi Arabia, and it was a lecture hall, but with a barrier 2/3 of the way through, men on one side, a much smaller group of women on the other side of the barrier. And somebody asked him, Mr. Gates, Saudi Arabia has the goal of becoming one of the top 10 countries in the world in technology. Is that feasible? Gates looked out and then he said, and this is Bill of Arabia, and he said that, I think he got it exactly right, that if you're not fully utilizing half the talent in the country, you're not going to get too close to the top 10. And that, these issues of injustice are important, but just as an issue of utilizing what resources poor countries have, it's so important to take advantage of half the population that right now tends to be sorely neglected. If this is the cause of our time, what would an agenda look like? I think everybody will have their own ideas of that. You've heard a lot of ideas over the last couple of days. Let me give you a personal sense of some of the issues that resonate the most with me. One is human trafficking. This is a Cambodian brothel. These girls were kidnapped in rural areas, sold to the brothel. When one talks about this being a form of modern slavery, I think people often, again, think that's spin, that's hyperbole. This is a girl I met, Long Cross. She was kidnapped at age 13. The brothel owner, who was a woman, found her recalcitrant and uncooperative and gouged out her eye. When you meet somebody like Long Cross, there's just no other word for this than slavery. And indeed, there are a couple of differences from traditional slavery. One has to do with the scale of it. The peak of the transatlantic slave trade was the 1780s. And in that decade, just under 80,000 slaves a year were transported from Africa to the New World. Just under 80,000. Right now, the State Department estimate is that about 800,000 people are trafficked across international borders each year. And that doesn't even include girls like Long Cross, who are trafficked within a country and not across a border. Secondly, another difference from traditional slavery is that these slaves are, in a sense, so valueless that they're disposable. Obviously, 18th and 19th century slaves were brutally mistreated, but they were also valuable, and so masters did not want them to die. In terms of present dollars, a slave in the early 19th century was worth about 40,000 US dollars in today's money. In contrast, a girl like Long Cross or a girl in a brothel in India, in Pakistan, in Malaysia is typically worth a few $100s. And as a result, the brothel owners are prepared to gouge out an eye, or particularly in Indian brothels, to kill them, or in Pakistani brothels, to kill them if they're uncooperative, because they don't represent much value.